No, you're not misreading the title. North Korea has apparently joined the war in Ukraine. They've really been involved for quite a while now. However, we're just getting confirmation from Ukrainian President Zelensky that they have actual troops on the ground, not only in Ukraine, but training inside of Russia that are preparing to enter into ground operations. Meanwhile, in Korea, they're ratcheting up the temperature while China launches large-scale drills around Taiwan. There's a lot to talk about right now, so we're going to start by talking about what North Korea is doing right now in Ukraine and why they're going about that and what some of those risks are. There's a lot to talk about right now, so we're going to start by talking about what North Korea is doing right now in Ukraine, what led up to this, and what might be coming next. We're also going to hit on what's going on in Korea and why that matters and why that ties into this overall strategic picture here. And we're also going to wrap up by talking about what North Korea might be hoping to accomplish with all of this and what some of the risks that they're facing out of all of this. First, note that North Korea has been supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine for a little over a year now. This has been in the form of ballistic missiles, which were provided to Russia for use in their invasion of Ukraine. Russia has maintained a large-scale strategic bombing campaign on Ukraine since the war began. This campaign has made use of all types of weapon systems that Russia has, including cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, and even hypersonics. However, this has become a very expensive endeavor with fairly dubious results. Ukraine still maintains the ability to fight after over 2.5 years of bombing attacks. Instead of targeting key government buildings in places like Kiev, where they can disrupt Ukraine's ability to govern, or target Ukraine's ability to train new soldiers should Russia start targeting training bases, they've instead targeted civilian areas, including ports, hospitals, and residential areas. It's effectively a terror campaign and not so much a bombing campaign to degrade Ukraine's ability to fight. And like I said, this has become very expensive for Russia. It's significantly impacted their cruise missile stockpile, although the use of drones and ballistic missiles has reduced the impact. And this is where North Korea comes in. North Korea has supplied ballistic missiles for months, and that's helped Russia to maintain their campaign. So far, it looks like it's just been short-range ballistic missiles of the Hwasong-11 variety. However, even just that has helped Russia to maintain its attack and really reduce the burden on some of its other more costly to produce platforms. This article by the New York Times describes how some of these missiles, which were used in an attack in August, were manufactured earlier this year. This shows a fairly quick turnaround between production and use, meaning that some of these missiles were actually produced for the purpose of being used in Ukraine, and that's really helping North Korea not have to dip into its own stockpile that maybe it would want to be using for, say, a war in Korea. The article also describes how these missiles appear to be made with foreign support, which, shocker, yeah, I know. We've already discussed in a past video on my other channel, and I'll have a link to that down in the description, on how this relationship has really grown between Russia and North Korea. Basically, a quick snapshot of that is Russia has increased its level of cooperation with North Korea in exchange for arms. And that level of cooperation between Russia and North Korea has really helped develop North Korea's nuclear and missile program. And while the North Korean support for Russia had, at least up to this point, involved artillery ammunition and ballistic missiles, it now appears that troops are also going to be part of the equation here. This all comes with meetings between high-ranking Russian and North Korean officials, to include meetings between Putin and Kim Jong-un in North Korea and Eastern Russia this past year. And now I think that takes us to a more interesting development that personally I did not think that we were going to see. North Korean troops in Ukraine. Now there are two different lines of effort here that I want us to talk about. The first is what appears to be a grouping of North Korean troops assisting in artillery training in Mariupol, which is in southern Ukraine, and the other is the grouping of North Korean citizens that are operating in a battalion in Russia along the border of Ukraine. Now the size of that battalion has changed. I've seen anywhere from as low as 3,000, but I've also seen as high as 10,000 according to one Ukrainian newspaper. Again, it's a Ukrainian newspaper, so take it with a grain of salt here. The artillery training group appears to just be assisting with training, but this does free up Russian troops to assist with actual war fighting. Russia may also be using more and more systems from North Korea that may require North Korean troops to actually administer the training themselves. In a recent missile strike in Donetsk on a Russian military demonstration, it's reported that 6 of the 20 killed were actually North Korean officers. Meanwhile, it's also been reported that a new battalion has been formed in Russia and is made up of roughly 3,000 DPRK citizens. Again, that estimate could be as high as 10,000. We really don't know for sure yet. This could be another Little Green Men scenario where these are actual North Korean troops that are just acting as civilian volunteers to give North Korea some deniability, though. It's also been reported that this battalion may become engaged in fighting in Kursk as well as in Ukraine. And to top it all off, we've already got reports of individual North Korean troops from this unit already escaping. In fact, it's been reported that around 18 North Koreans have escaped from this unit and have made a bum rush for the Ukrainian border. Now, this is a huge development, and that leads to a lot of questions that I have in the strategic sense that I want to talk about here. Firstly, and this is something that's been discussed a little on Twitter, but what happens when Ukraine captures a DPRK citizen operating on behalf of Russia? Now, there's two things here, and I want to add a caveat up front. I'm not an MP, and I don't know all the rules and regulations involved here. I'm also obviously not a lawyer. However, I have been at an MP headquarters for the past 4 years now with the reserves, and I've had the opportunity to sit in on a lot of discussions and exercises where we've talked about pretty much this kind of situation on how to handle detainees and how the routing, situation gets kind of worked out depending on what their classification is. So if you're an MP or a lawyer and you know for sure, definitely let me know down in the comments, but I'm just going to talk about basically what I think based on the conversations that we've had in the past. First, there's a question of what their actual status is as a combatant. That is whether they're uniformed or acting as an official member of the Russian or North Korean armed forces. If not, then they're acting as mercenaries. Now, the difference here is their legal status under the Geneva Conventions and whether they're treated as a recognized legal armed combatant or whether they're treated as effectively a criminal. Legal armed combatants are entitled to different kinds of protections whenever they're captured. A mercenary or a civilian volunteer that's not part of the uniformed military, they do get treated a little differently. They might get put in a different kind of prison, like even a civilian prison, or tried separately. In the case of a mercenary, they will be sent to a military tribunal in Ukraine, and that will determine their designation under the Geneva Convention and really where they go after that. This specific unit that has been established for these North Korean citizens falls under the 11th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade, which is actually directly part of the Russian Uniformed Armed Forces. So I'd imagine that these individuals are operating under an official status as official members of the Russian Armed Forces. However, they also might just be a volunteer battalion that's been subordinated to the 11th, and that in that case, the question would be how exactly they are treated. And this wouldn't necessarily be unprecedented. We've seen in other cases in this war, like for instance with Wagner or other groups, where mercenary formations are subordinated to uniformed elements of the Russian military. There's also a question on if these are actual DPRK soldiers that are operating clandestinely for Russia, and if that clandestine activity denies them their Geneva Convention status, given that officially they're there as volunteers. As I understand it, Ukraine will need to convene a military tribunal, and this is something that they probably have already had since the beginning of the war, and that tribunal is going to basically go through each individual detainee case and determine whether or not they are entitled to Geneva Convention protections or if they're tried as a criminal. Effectively, is this individual a legal combatant or is this person like a mercenary or something that we can try as a criminal? And that will basically route them through, okay, either we're going to put them in this kind of detention facility that we're putting other legal combatants, or we're going to put them in a civilian prison and they're going to be charged with a crime and serve their sentence. Now, the next issue that I have questions about here is repatriation. And this is another question that I've seen on Twitter, and this is stemmed from the idea that North Korea would not want back its soldiers. Personally, I doubt this. I think that they'll probably want about as many people back as they possibly can get back, but in cases like, where soldiers have escaped, like those 18 individuals we already talked about, or even if they've been captured, they may not necessarily want those individuals back. And the reason for that is fairly simple. They've tasted of the world. They've been outside of North Korea. They've seen what the rest of the world is like. Maybe even if they've been captured and they've been held in a detention facility, they might be getting treated better than North Korea. They might be receiving 3 square meals a day, socialized really well, able to speak their minds freely, and given creature comforts that really we in the West kind of take for granted and don't even think about as things that, someone would appreciate. But whenever you've been, you've never had those things before, then that might be something to think about. It's even worse in the cases of escape where, say, a DPRK soldier manages to escape their unit, get behind Ukrainian lines and seek asylum in Ukraine or somewhere else in Europe. The country may not necessarily want to send them, if they grant, especially if they grant them asylum, the person definitely isn't going to want to go back, and North Korea may not necessarily want them back either. So then the question with the captured persons is what exactly gets done about those individuals, especially if North Korea doesn't want them back. Are they held indefinitely? Are they given asylum or a chance to basically defect and become part of society where they've been captured? Then becomes their status in the world. Are they effectively stateless people? Now, I would imagine that North Korea would want to do something about a large surge in vocal North Korean troops who may feel like they've been abandoned by their country. They might have some kinds of, trauma that have happened from the conflict as they've experienced it up to that point. And now they're being protected by a wealthier, stronger European country or another country that has taken them in. North Korea may not necessarily care what they say to Westerners. They will, however, care if they manage to contact friends or family back in North Korea and start sharing their story. That could be a real problem. Now, before we get too far down the risks for North Korea here, I want to talk about one more thing that's going on in the Korean peninsula that kind of ties into this entire situation. While all of this is going on, North Korea accused South Korea of dropping leaflets from a drone over Pyongyang. North Korea is very sensitive to drones and leaflets. They've ratcheted up tensions in the peninsula over balloons carrying leaflets and loudspeakers on the DMZ in the past. North Korea has a special little information bubble that they really like to keep their citizens in and they like to protect. Any threat to that information bubble, they really interpret as a threat to the regime. And they take that stuff very seriously and they tend to react to that stuff. So Kim Jong-un convened his military leadership and ordered the artillery units along the DMZ to full combat readiness. He also ordered the destruction of 2 large rail bridges between North and South Korea. South Korea responded by saying that if any South Korean citizen is harmed, then they will end the regime, which I would say is a pretty strong message. Now, before you freak out from all of this, let's just take a minute. Firstly, what North Korea is trying to do right now is just puff up its chest, look really, really tough, and really just be kind of scary. And that's worked fairly well in the past. I mean, especially with the United States, you see how risk adverse we are, especially right now with Ukraine and the Middle East. This is one of those areas that we really try to avoid a war generally because it would be pretty bad in Korea. And so North Korea knows that and they're just going to play up to our fear to get us to back down. South Korea, however, has new leadership and they're kind of done with the hijinks and they're yelling back. So North Korea will either have to escalate further and continue to look scary or just kind of back down, but continue on with their domestic messaging saying, look, we've looked scary. We've taken down, the Western, imperialists again. And then just kind of ignore the part where, South Korea tells them, we'll end you. And now that takes us to the risk rabbit hole because, as you can tell, there is a lot to discuss here. First, on sending troops to Ukraine. The obvious risk here is that their own soldiers may escape, and some already have. And they could become a risk to their precious information bubble later by attempting to communicate back to friends and family members back in North Korea. That's obviously much easier said than done. However, that's just a thing to think about. If they escape, the DPRK government can just tell their families that they were killed in combat and wipe their hands of the situation. That obviously has risks because imagine if the soldier contacts their family or friends, that could risk inviting further scrutiny of the government and of the regime. That's not something that they can afford. They could also say that they defected and choose to demonize them. That again, however, has risk because again, if that soldier contacts their family back in North Korea and they let them know effectively what happened, maybe that they were abandoned by their government, that again allows that family to start questioning the narrative, and that again becomes an issue. Now, these issues begin to compound and scale up in scope as more soldiers begin to escape. Again, we're already talking right now about 18 of these cases that could potentially happen, and that's before this unit has even engaged in any combat. They're still in, the Kursk, Bryansk region of Russia, but if they move into, say Ukraine, and, it's been rumored that this unit might be used in some more high-risk operations, we're talking about the possibility of a lot of these soldiers ending up getting captured, going AWOL and defecting. And, if this starts getting into the case of like hundreds of soldiers that have escaped or been captured, that could be a real problem. There's also the risk of what to do with these soldiers once they go home. Like I've already said, this unit might be used in some more high-risk operations, and the Ukrainians have already called out this unit and vowed to welcome them into the conflict. So let's imagine some of these soldiers survive, they don't get captured, they remain with the unit until the end of the conflict, and then they get returned back to North Korea. And maybe they have, some of the kind of PTSD that a lot of soldiers have, maybe a lot of them have injuries. North Korea doesn't necessarily strike me as a country that is very accommodating of these kinds of things, but maybe I'm wrong. But again, anything that can lead to further scrutiny is certainly an issue for the regime. That said, North Korea has existed for about 70 years, and they've sent troops abroad to fight in other conflicts before in the past, several times. And so they probably have some pretty well-used methods on dealing with these kinds of things. Now, the next risk is for Russia on Ukraine. Introducing a new party into this conflict expands its scope. We've already seen this conflict expand into the Middle East and Africa where, say Ukrainian special forces have chased down Russian Wagner troops and other kinds of operators, not only in the Middle East, but in Africa, and how that has expanded the scope onto, several other different continents. Now we're introducing a whole other military into this conflict. Again, whether they're operating as quote-unquote volunteers to have some kind of deniability, we already know of uniformed North Koreans that are operating in a training capacity in Mariupol. Now, the tired narrative about this conflict is that this is all just a big proxy war between the US and Russia. Now, the cool one is that this is a proxy war between North and South Korea, because South Korea is also helping to arm Ukraine. That said, due to the high rates of attrition suffered through the war, Russia itself is having its own manpower problem. So much so that this is where the North Koreans come in. Well, at scale, this is still relatively small. Again, we're only talking about somewhere between 3,000 to 10,000 soldiers. It could easily scale up depending on North Korea's agreement with Russia and what the DPRK's willingness is to actually send more troops into this conflict. Those 3,000 troops could go into the conflict in Ukraine, get beat up pretty bad, and then, the DPRK could just kind of decide, okay, this is more than we bargained for. We're not sending anybody else. Russia, you're going to have to figure it out. Or they could be deciding that what they're getting in return from Russia in their nuclear and missile program is so good that they're willing to send more troops because they're really getting something good in return. Now, in doing all of this, though, Ukraine may be able to start campaigning for European partners and other countries to begin sending volunteers to assist them with their manpower problems. And we've already sort of seen that with Zelensky's messaging following the reports of these North Korean troops. Right now, they're effectively soloing a war against two nuclear powers while having a significant manpower shortage themselves, and that needs to be resolved ASAP. Now, the final risk here that I want to discuss is on North Korea and the risks to itself in Korea. The deeper that North Korea gets embedded in this conflict in Ukraine and the higher that it increases its temperature in Korea, the more concerning that things will get in Pyongyang, the more scrutiny that will fall upon the Kim Jong-un regime. As the US election is coming to its conclusion, that will also really spell trouble for things on the Korean Peninsula, more for North Korea, depending on who wins. Neither candidate has been super favorable to North Korea. However, one of them certainly already has past experience playing hardball with Kim Jong-un and achieving some positive results, at least for the United States. With everything going on, should Kim Jong-un want to de-escalate the situation himself, he may opt to slow the pace of aid to Russia and really kind of look for off-ramps here. That being said, he might feel emboldened because he now has backing from both Russia and China, two pretty strong, reliable powers that are nuclear and very robust. So he might interpret that as, he's got top cover, so he can effectively do whatever he wants right now. Now, with all of that, we've talked about a lot of stuff here, and I want to hear your thoughts. So comment your thoughts down below. Let's keep this conversation going. Leave a like if you found this video helpful or interesting, and that also really helps this channel grow and reach new audiences. Subscribe for more videos just like this, and I will catch you all next time. Later.